Alrighty, welcome to another exciting lesson of Pro Mandarin. Now you're probably wondering, is he ever going to change anything up? Well, you guessed it, I am going to change things up, but just a little bit for this lesson, and maybe for the next few lessons. So what I did last week was I recorded some of the monologues and conversations that I had with other people in Chinese over Thanksgiving weekend while we were visiting the Valley of Fire in the state of Nevada. And I'd like to share some of that with you in this video. And then we'll go ahead and break down what it was that I was saying, why I was saying it, how I was saying it, all that kind of stuff. And then towards the end of this video, I'll go ahead and get you some practice in like I normally do. Now, I'll be breaking up the Thanksgiving vacation into a few different videos, so be prepared to check those ones out too. In this video, it'll be more of a monologue that I was having so that I could kind of explain what it is that we do every Thanksgiving. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and check it out. But before we do that, you're probably wondering, can I learn all this Chinese in one lesson? Well, let's find out. So first we're going to go ahead and watch the video, and we're going to break down the first part of this video, not the whole thing, just because we only have so much time to work with here. All right, so let's go ahead and check that out.
这个小山看起来很陡，但是不滑，所以直接能跑上去。就爬山的时候就可以跑上去，不用用手扶着那个山。你看我这样。但是大家就觉得太陡或者什么的，所以他们就有点害怕。你看这个还是比较陡，但是还是能爬上去，多容易！你看我就不用手爬上去。这边也很陡，这边有可能我会扶着一下，或者会。对，我扶着一下。风景挺好看，我比较高，挺好玩的。你们敢不敢上来？刚刚从山上要下来，这个是最简单的。最安全的方法下来。
All right, so welcome back. All right, so for the first sentence that I said in this video so far, I said 这个小山看起来很陡，但是不滑，所以直接能跑上去。Now, I'm going to break this down a little bit more and explain to you why I said things the way I did. So for the first phrase, 这个小山, that means this little mountain or this hill, as we would say it. And then the next part of the phrase is 看起来很陡. So what I'm saying there is 看起来 is it looks like, and then I put the adjective afterwards, 很陡, which means very steep. Then I follow that up with 但是不滑, which means but it's not slippery or it's not slick. And then down below I have 所以直接能 which I didn't quite finish what I was saying. However, what I'm saying there is so 所以 means so or therefore, 直接 means direct or straightforward or something along those lines, and then 能 means can, and then was just a sound that I made while I was thinking about how I wanted to finish my thought. So the 所以直接能 means so you could directly, and then I follow it up with 跑上去, which means to run up it or to run on top of it. Okay? Now, a little note on the it takes the sound from the word just before it. So since nung ends with a G, you would pronounce it with a slight little ga, so it would be nung like that, instead of nung which would sound a little awkward. You wanted to make sure that it flows. To give you another example, 好 is a very common phrase of saying like, all right, cool, or something like that. Like, yeah, let's do that, whatever it is that you're responding to. Now, you wouldn't say 好 because that would sound very awkward. So what does happen is when you say 好, your lips purse into a W kind of sound. So you would actually say 好 even though it's not spelled that way, that's the way you'd pronounce it. All right, let's go ahead and move on here. So what we got here is I said 就爬山的时候就可以跑上去，不用用手扶着那个山。你看我这样。 All right, so for the first part of this, I said 就 and I put that in parentheses because I really didn't need to say it there. So we're going to go ahead and skip the 就 right there because it didn't really make sense or really didn't need to be said there. All right, so then we got 爬山. So 爬山 means to climb a mountain or to hike. And then we have 的时候. Now, the best way to think of this is if we go ahead and pull this out and use the full structure, 当的时候. So, as an example, if I were to say, 当我小的时候，我爱吃糖, what I'm saying is when I was little, at that time, I used to eat candy. So I explained this in my When Are You Gonna Learn Mandarin Part 1 video, where I explained that you can actually leave off 当, which in our minds would be when, and you can just say 的时候 in the middle. It still means the same thing. When I was little, I used to eat candy. Even though we're saying I was little at that time, I used to eat candy. But we don't say it that way in English. So that's just something that you'll get used to. It splits up part 1 and part 2 of the sentence. Now, in the sentence that we used, the way to understand it is when you're climbing or hiking this hill at that time, you could just run up it, or you can simply run up it. So again, we're leaving off the when in this case. And that's perfectly fine. It makes sense. They say it all the time this way. All right, let's go ahead and go on to the next couple words here. And then this 就, now 就 has so many different meanings, but in this case, we're probably going to mean it to mean something like simply or just, and then 可以 means can. And then we got 跑上去. So again, this means to run up or to run on top of. Now the next part I say 不用, and then I'm thinking about what I want to say here. So then I said 不用用手扶着. So really I would just want to say the 用 just once. And what I'm saying here is you don't have to use your hand to support yourself. Now, it is a little bit redundant because 扶着 means to use your hand to support yourself. If you look it up on Google Translate or dbell.com, for some reason they'll say hold something in your hand, but that's kind of confusing because it doesn't really mean something that you hold and you grab and you walk around with it. It's more of something you support yourself with your hand, as in so you don't fall over, something like that. Okay? Now, just real quick, I could have said 你不需要用手 and then followed up with 扶着, which would be a little more clear of saying you don't need to use your hand, something like that. But you could, if you're just giving some directions, you don't necessarily need to say the 需要 in this case. So 不用手扶着, you don't use hand to support yourself. Or in other words, you don't have to use your hand to support yourself is the way that we would actually say it. Okay? And then 那个山, so I said that mountain. Now, I changed what I was saying there. Instead of saying 小山, I said 山. And I noticed that Chinese people aren't really too particular about stuff like that, so I'm not being too particular either. But I really mean that hill, or at least a small mountain anyway. So to finish this off, I said 你看我这样. So that was a little bit more instructive language, saying like, look at me like this. That's all I'm saying, like, hey, check this out. I'm going to do it like this, okay? So then I demonstrate how to run right up it. All right, then the next phrase we have is 但是大家觉得太陡或者什么的. So the first half of this, 但是大家觉得太陡, which means but everyone thinks or everyone feels like it's too steep. So 但是 means but or however, and then 大家 means everyone. Although breaking it apart means big family, but 大家 in reality means everyone. So one of the things that you'll hear them say in a big event, if somebody's on a microphone or something, they'll say 大家好, which means hey everyone or hello everyone, like that. And then 觉得 means to think or to feel, and then 太陡 means too steep. All right, so let's go on to the next part of that phrase, 或者什么的. So what I was saying there is or whatever. Now, 什么的 means and so on, but in this case, I was using it as in whatever, like, or whatever, like that kind of a phrase. And the last part, to complete that thought, I say, 所以他们就有一点害怕. So what I'm saying there is, so they are simply, or they are just, and then I say, 有一点害怕, a little bit scared, or a little bit afraid, okay? And then we come to the last part of that first video for what we're covering today. The first little phrase is 你看. Like I said before, 你看我 is to look at me. Well, in this case, I'm saying you look, or in other words, I'm just saying, all right, check it out, or look at that, or something like that, okay? Which, just to let you know, I learned that from my father-in-law because he says it all the time whenever he's showing me stuff, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind, that that's how they say it. And then we got 这个还是比较陡. That means this is actually kind of steep. Like I just realized something that I didn't know before. Now, the reason why I'm saying it's something that I didn't realize before is because 还是 means quite a few different things. It means still, yet. It also means or, and also it's an expression of something that you didn't realize. So that's the reason why I use the word actually, even though there's other words to use to mean actually, but in this case, that's what I'm meaning behind it. Now, 比较 means comparatively or quite, okay? And then we already know the other two words, 这个 and 陡, this and steep. All right, so for the next part of the phrase, we have 但是还是能爬上去. So right here we got 但是, which means but, or however again. And then this 还是 is not the same as the other 还是. In this case, I'm saying still, okay? And then 能, again, is one way of saying can, and 爬上去 means to climb up it or to hike up it. So again, 但是还是能爬上去. So what I'm saying here is, but you can still climb up it, okay? So again, what I'm saying here is, look, this is actually a little bit steep, but you can still climb up it. All right, and then the next phrase, a little standalone phrase, you can put 多 and then whatever adjective behind it to say like how or so or quite. So what you're saying here is 容易, which means easy. So this is quite easy, or this is so easy, or how easy is that? Okay, so something along those lines. And then 这边我有可能会扶着一下. Now, you might notice that sometimes I'll say 这边 and sometimes 这边. That's because originally I learned it with 这边, and then later on, because of my in-laws, they're from Northeast China, they tend to say 这边. So whoops. So I actually say things the way that they say it, and sometimes I revert back to the way that I learned it originally. All right, so that just means here. And then the next part of this phrase is 我有可能, which means I probably, and then I follow it up with 会, which in this case means will. It can also mean can, but in this case we're going to use it as will. So 我有可能会. So I probably will, and then 扶着一下. That means I'm just going to support myself a little bit. Or to put it all together, 这边我有可能会扶着一下 is like I might have to, or I probably will support myself right here. Now, that 一下 is just to say kind of like a little bit or something along those lines, like just for a sec. And then to follow up that same thought, I say 或者会对我扶着一下. So what I was doing there is I kind of stopped myself because I was going to say something else. I said 或者会, which means or I will. And then I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then I said, yeah, I'm just going to support myself. So that's what I'm getting at when I say that. 对，我会扶着一下. And then the last phrase here for today's lesson before we move on is 风景挺好看. Now I'll break this down into three parts. 风景 is scenery, and then 挺 means quite, and then 好看 means looks good or is beautiful. So 风景挺好看 means the scenery is quite beautiful or it looks quite good. And in American or Californian English, we would probably say something like, hey, the scenery looks pretty good. So we say pretty not as in it's beautiful, but as in really or quite. Okay, now let's go ahead and move on to the next section. But before we do that, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. It really helps me out so I can continue to make quality content like this video. All right, now back to the lesson. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give you these words real quick. What we have is 这个, which means this, and 那个, which means that. Then we have 人, which means person. Then we have 小山, which means a little mountain or a hill. Then we have 悬崖, which means a cliff or a precipice or something like that. And then we have 湖, which means a lake. And then we have 风景, which means scenery. And then over here we have 比较 and 挺. 比较 means comparatively or quite, and then 挺 means quite as well. So in other words, it's another way of saying really or pretty or something like that. Again, pretty as in really or very, rather than whether it's beautiful or not. And then we're going to follow it up with a few different adjectives here. So the first one we got is 恐怖, which means scary. And then we got 好玩, which means fun or it's interesting or something along those lines. Now there's another way to say it's interesting, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. And then we got 好看, which means it looks good or it's beautiful. And then we got 高, which is tall or high, 远, which is far, and then we have 深, which is deep, and then the last one we have is 有意思, which means it is interesting. Now, you probably have noticed that you really wouldn't use all of these nouns with all of these adjectives. You wouldn't do it in English, well, you wouldn't do it in Chinese either. So for the first three of them, you're probably not going to use 深 because it really wouldn't make any sense. So you don't normally refer to a hill or a cliff as in deep. You'd refer to it as in high or tall or something like that, right? However, with lake, you would refer to it as deep. You probably wouldn't refer to it as high. And then 风景, we're only going to use it with 好看 or 有意思. So it's interesting scenery, or it looks good, or it's beautiful, or something like that. So for the rest of them, we can pretty much use almost all of them. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple examples, and then I'll give you 2 or 3 practice questions right after that to finish off the lesson. So for the first example, if you were to say that person is quite interesting, and you don't mean it in a sarcastic way, you genuinely do mean it, you could say something like 那个人挺有意思, okay? That person's really interesting, or that person's quite interesting, or even that person's quite funny. So again, 那个人挺有意思. All right, and then let's say you wanted to say this cliff is comparatively tall, okay? You're saying it's quite tall, you're saying whatever, but we're just going to use comparatively just so we can differentiate the two between 比较 and 挺, okay? So the way you would say that is 这个悬崖比较高. 这个悬崖比较高. All right, now how would you say this scenery is comparatively beautiful, or it looks comparatively good, or quite good? Okay, how would you say that? 这个风景比较好看. 这个风景比较好看. All right, now how would you say that hill is quite far? 那个小山挺远. 那个小山挺远. All right, now how would you say that person is comparatively scary? So they're really scary, okay? But you're just going to use comparatively here. So how would you say that? 那个人比较恐怖. 那个人比较恐怖. All right, before I finish up today's lesson, I'm going to go ahead and give you 3 more questions that you can answer in the comments below. So the first one is, this lake is quite deep. And then the second one is, this person is quite fun, or he's a lot of fun. And then the last one you're going to say, that lake is comparatively far. So go ahead and write those answers in the comments below. And if you like this video, make sure you 点赞, 订阅和分享这个视频, which means to like, subscribe, and share this video. And until next time, 下次见.